Good afternoon and welcome to Land, Life and Liberation, Part 1. My name is Sally Frater and I am the Curator of Contemporary Art at the Art Gallery of Guelph. I am going to begin our time together with the recitation of the Art Gallery of Guelph's Land Acknowledgement. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Turtle Island. As we gather together, we would like to acknowledge that the Art Gallery of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people, and more recently, these treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant to this land and offer respect to our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors as we strive to strengthen our relationships with them. Haudenosaunee and Métis neighbors as we strive to strengthen our relationships with them. We express our gratitude for sharing these lands for a mutual benefit. Although we are convening virtually and might individually be located in different places, it is useful for all of us to remember that wherever we are in what are currently referred to as the Americas, we are on Indigenous land, and that we should move forward in a spirit of mindfulness and reciprocity. Before we begin, some brief housekeeping notes. Since we are in Zoom webinar, everyone's microphones are turned off, and you are welcome to submit questions throughout the conversation using the chat function, and we will share them. Following the close of the conversation, we'll have a Q&A where viewers can participate in broader dialogue. Land, Life, and Liberation is a series of 5 conversations that will unfold as an accompaniment to the Decolonize This Place exhibition, When We Breathe Together, which is currently on at the Art Gallery of Guelph. More information about this program, this installation, can be found online on the AGG website. The exhibition and conversations centered the Decolonial Operations Manual, which is this document here. And this can be downloaded on the websites of both Decolonize This Place and the Art Gallery of Guelph. As a starting point for reflection and action, the Decolonial Operations Manual embodies the principle of movement-generated media and is a document offered as a tool of study, reflection, and action. The manual is grounded in 5 years of collective thinking, art making, and organizing undertaken by Decolonize This Place with dozens of groups in New York City, Lena Pihoking, and beyond, with numerous references to movement work preceding the establishment of DTP in 2016 as well. The scale, material, quantity, and distribution form of the manual underscores the importance of freely shared printed matter in the work of movement building. And I just thought I'd offer a few words about how this project came together at the Art Gallery of Guelph. I have been working in the cultural sector for a number of years as a curator, and the work that I do in and outside a variety of institutional spaces is largely based on who I am and the experiences of myself and larger groups that I consider myself to be a member of or affiliated with. And a lot of the work that I do is predicated on the work of artist collaborators, people who are making work about place, about identity, about migration, about the prison industrial complex, about abuses of class and race and gender, and also the importance of inclusion and recollection and belonging. And I suppose over the past year, for those of us who are working in similar ways, or both in and outside of the space of arts organizations, at a moment of a global pandemic, following a number of uprisings in resistance against a number of racial abuses, a lot of us have taken the time to sort of reflect on the work that we're doing, how it's connected to movements that are happening on a global scale. So how the distance between where we're located and elsewhere can be collapsed, but also the integrity and the sincerity of some of these actions. And I know that these are things that I have been sort of mulling over the past few months. And when there was an opening in our exhibition schedule, it suddenly occurred to me that this would be a good opportunity to offer an invitation to a collective of people whose work I've been following for the past 5 years, and their insistence on sort of direct action and honesty and accountability has sustained me and countless others who consider ourselves fortunate enough to be able to do this work. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to come together through the space of an exhibition and virtually when we can't be together physically at this time. The conversations that will take place in this series will explore a number of threads related to the confluence of land, sovereignty, liberation, and resistance. Today's participants include the members of Decolonize This Place, along with Maria Hupfield, Jason Mujan, Mikinak Migwans, Ben Nduga Kabuye, Shelleen Rodriguez, and Brittany Williams. Before each participant speaks, I'm going to ask you all to briefly introduce yourselves. I welcome you all, and I'm going to turn things over to Emin and Natasha.
Hi, thank you so much, Sally, for that introduction, and thank you for bringing us this project. We usually don't work with institutions in this way. I think the last time we did something like this was at Artist Space, where we met the rest of the crazies who are on this call. So this is actually a really amazing moment for us because it's a kind of a recap of 5 years of work that we've been doing. So, I mean, I'm not going to take a lot of time. I just wanted to say that what we're hoping today for this conversation is to be able to think about, reflect, and as the manual is there, reflect, study about action, and specifically think about the failures that we've had and the successes as well, but specifically the failures that we've had in building the kind of relations that we desire, right? And what have been some of our challenges within that. The reason why I mentioned this is because, over the last 5 years, we've seen really crazy turns, both in terms of decolonial and land back movements that have been happening, both, in the US and in Canada. And then specifically with FTP and the George Floyd stuff, and before that our organizing with the Whitney Museum kind of brought and the organizing against Ford Foundation kind of brought the role of NGOs and counterinsurgency specifically within the abolitionist movement to kind of a height. And then lastly, I think the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges, is how do our organizing spaces and specifically movements in the United States and in Canada and in the West overall tackle the problem of anti-imperialism, or this kind of, the problem that we see where, the kind of exceptionalization of the Western organizing kind of tactics and strategies in our movement spaces. So in a short, kind of a way, how do we build, abolitionist, decolonial, anti-imperialist spaces in the same breath, right? And not as separate issue silos, and not that we lose the specificity of these struggles, because it's really important that we see from each of these perspectives and each of these lenses. But then, what does solidarity look like? When we mean land back, abolition, and no nation states. So that's it. And what we could do is just go around, maybe not the DTP folks first, but other folks could just introduce themselves and maybe share something for 2-3 minutes, which is a starter for a conversation, and then we go from there.
Just so I can just say, just to add and pass it on, the intention of our engagement with Guelph and with Sally, Sally's been a large part of us participating in this and giving us the kind of collaborative space for us to do what we think is needed and to make use of a gallery space and its resources for something other than or more than. So I think the intention really was to kind of create a frame that can allow us to have important conversations. These are really what we were working towards. And so the manual, in a way, is to kind of ground this conversation. But within we anticipate 5 conversations that will happen bi-weekly, where they build on each other, both in an analysis that leads towards action. That can be an initiative, that could, whatever that looks like, that kind of embodies this kind of politics. And it's one that's based on relationality and kind of responsibility. But our intention from these conversations is to produce something tangible to come out of this, and not just conversation for conversation's sake. So with that, and passing it on, it's about you being present and bringing whatever you want to share that you think is important for this moment. And people can just go. I think that if you just kind of do raise your hand or whatever, and then we can just loosely facilitate. Come on, y'all. Maria, maybe start with you and Jason. Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
Maria, why don't you go first, since you're a Anishinaabe and we're on your turf?
Okay, so I'm in Jason's studio here in Toronto. Let me know if you can hear me okay, because I'm above, there's some skateboarders in the next space. So you may hear a body fall once in a while, and a lot of noise. But anyway, it's really good to be here. Wenena Bojo, calling in from Toronto, over in Cabbagetown. Our treaty partners, who I like to acknowledge, are the Mississauga of the Credit, who, and also the Dish with One Spoon treaty, which I've heard has been broken, and there's a lot of work happening around that. So I'm back here in Toronto after, it's 2 years after living in New York. So it's really good to see some familiar faces here. What else can I say? I'm a Borderlands Fellow at the Vera List Center and the Center for the Imaginary in the Borderlands that Natalie Diaz runs at Arizona State University. And I also am a Canadian Research Chair at the University of Toronto. And I run a space, a research space that is not a lab. It's I call it the Indigenous Creation Studio. So we're really looking at connecting Indigenous methodologies with the work that happens in that space, because a lot of Indigenous work isn't theorized. And then I guess the other thing I want to throw out there is thinking about art outside of the institution, but also art as a more expansive definition, art moving in this direction where art can become this idea of like Indigenous story work, or story work in a more expansive scope that connects community, that connects ceremony, that connects dance, and all these other ideas. So that's a little bit about me. And I work with my husband, Jason Lujan. It appears to be a lot of Jason Luhans here today, but I'll let my collaborator with Native Art Department, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Maria. So I am the original Jason Lujan. All other Jason Luhans on this panel originate from my link. So it's, I just moved here in 2019 from New York City after working in museums for 20 years and having a really successful career. What's funny is I was looking at, as I have actually operated an office at some point in time at every museum that Decolonize This Place has had some sort of protest at. Maybe not at the exact moment you were doing work there, but, and so what's funny is the image for this one is in front of the Met, which is one of my favorite places to work. And, you know, and one of the things and I was, at the time, I was the only Native, quote unquote, Native American person working in a museum of 2,500 people. But it would be very strange because all these places would know my politics. And so occasionally someone would come in and put like a Decolonize This Place sticker somewhere on the wall or in the bathroom. And the security would run over to my office. Jason, something gonna happen? What's going on? And they would expect me to kind of out something that I had no knowledge of, and and I would usually answer with, I don't think this is official. I'm pretty sure they don't like merchandise stickers or things like that. Inevitably, though, they would get a photograph of the person, and so I think we all know by now that pre-pandemic there's been a drive in museums to automate ticket purchasing with kiosks, and one of the reasons is because they'll take your photo when you purchase tickets. So they don't advertise that, but it's well known. You'll see a little pinhole above the screen. And when you purchase tickets, takes your photo, and from that point on, they can track you, or from the point of, wherever you put the sticker on in the bathroom or what have you. And they would bring me those pictures and say, do you know these people? Well, no. And it was really funny because these security departments were also made up of artists too. I would go to their shows or their spouses' shows, and we would talk about this. So it was really funny to be in a situation where, and these security guards were almost always people of color. And they would say, well, what are we going to do about this kind of, is anything going to happen? If anything's going to happen, Jason, you'll let me know, right? And I'd be like, sure. But nothing ever, I was never involved with any of that kind of stuff. But it was unusual to be in a situation where inevitably we were always expected, during meetings, we would always turn to kind of workshopping solutions to finding a way for a museum to have equity, but without doing any of the work of having the justice that goes along with it. And so that's kind of what I think that's what I can contribute for this conversation. Cool.
Thank you. I would say, Shalene, Britt, people that are Mikinak, one of you, if you feel comfortable and ready to just share some thoughts and reflections, things that you want to bring into the room.
I mean, I can say some incoherent shit if you don't mind.
Go for it.
All right, what's up, everybody? I'm Shalene Rodriguez. I am coming to you live from the BX, from the Bronx in New York. Let's see, man, I've been rocking with DTP since 2016. I'm one of the crazies, as Natasha said, from artist space. I guess, like, when Amin and Natasha asked me to jump on this call, what always comes to mind for me, like if I'm going to talk about DTP or talk about the work that we've done collaboratively for the last 5 years together, is like the logic behind working with DTP, for me, how I see it. You know what I'm saying? I have been part of an organizing crew in the Bronx, a grassroots radical group called Take Back the Bronx, for the past 10 years. I said incoherent, so here goes the incoherency. I've been thinking a lot about New York City as like a contested space, right? Like, my people migrated here. We're the industrial migrants. We came here through either, Jim Crow, like, so as refugees from the South, or Operation Bootstrap from the Caribbean. That's more where I lean towards because I'm Puerto Rican. We made this place a home. We work here, we live here, we die here, we make children here. And that's sort of been the deal for a while. I'm thinking about how deindustrialization just ripped us apart, coupled with all of the plagues that were visited upon us. I mean, I don't have to go through it. Y'all know the story, And then the neoliberal shift. That neoliberal shift is a really interesting thing to think about. And the reason why it comes up is because of the organizing work that we've been doing together for the last 5 years. Because for us, the logic of working with DTP was like, well, we've been in a standoff against the elite of this city as the now expendable, the industrial, the now expendable industrial migrants that are no longer needed since deindustrialization, since the standoff with them for this land. They metaphorically burned our villages in the 70s. You feel me? So like thinking about decolonization and the structural violence of settler colonialism for us, these industrial migrants, that are like trying to stay home, trying to stay in the places that we've made home since we've gotten here, is like, it's an ongoing battle. It's an ongoing battle. So like when DTP presents like this framework that's like going into museum institutions to like rattle the fucking cage and be like, these are the people that are on the board here, this is how they connect. That makes sense to me. That makes sense to me because we know, I mean, it's well documented that when the city decided to move from managerial to entrepreneurial, it was the media and public relations boards, the tourism boards, the finance sector, the government, the real estate, all these folks formed an apparatus that includes museum institutions. They all sit on these boards. You see what I'm saying? Like, you know, Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller was the governor while his brother David was the CEO of Citibank, Chase Manhattan. You know what I'm saying? So like, it makes sense for us. For, you know, there's scales there. You know, for us in Take Back the Bronx, the scale is like, it's local. You know what I'm saying? Like we're fighting landlords. We're fighting, you know, the local councilman who's trying to rezone our neighborhoods. We're fighting the Bronx Borough President. We're fighting the police. But DTP presents it like what DTP does, because New York, the way it's split up, it's like, you know, there's the local, there's the inward facing fight, which is the city has to like deal with the leftover population and, you know, kind of, you know, without wanting to provide basic services for us, which we're always clamoring for because we're a city of people. Then there's the outward facing, which is that New York is the empire of the world, and it's a world stage and a contested space, and everybody wants to get on the mic here. You know what I'm saying? So like the connection to DTP is that they are rattling the cage on the world stage. They are hitting the global while hitting the local at the same time. And so for us, it makes sense. That's another theater of operation for us to get it, because it's twofold for us. Our enemy as the local is also the global in a really fucked up way. I guess I could explain that later down the road, but whatever. How y'all doing?
Thank you so much, Eileen. That's really, really important to bring in. Mikanak, yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Ani, everyone. Mikanak, Indigenous cause. I'm from Nishnabek, from Weaponization of unceded territory here. I'm really grateful to be here on territory that is in contestation and cooperation at different times between Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. I'm here recently at joined the faculty at U of T in the Art Museum and the Art History Department. I work with ancestral beings or objects in museums mostly. So what I do is I go in and I'm interested in bringing community members and bringing elders into collections with us and into museum spaces and being able to be the institutional access key that gets us in there so that we can reclaim some of the lines of knowledge transmission or some of the descent, some of the stuff that's been deliberately severed and kind of created as dead objects in museums. So I'm interested in that. And sometimes I guess it's I'm good at hanging around with these things, with these ancestral things in museums so much that it's difficult for me to remember how to interface with people. And I was interested when I was in New York City is when I started working with Decolonize This Place, and I'm interested in how once you're in a museum, how is that museum shaping your behavior, and how can you learn differently? So while I was in there, I think a lot of my work about critiques of museums as institutional spaces and as places where the machinery of the state, of citizenship, of teaching you how to be like a good citizen, all of those things are shaping you while you're in a museum. A museum is a space where you go learn how to be an ideal citizen, right? All those different logics of settler colonialism, all the logics of state building, they are operating on you as you are in the museum space. I want to think about how those museum spaces we can also go in there to learn how to resist those structures, right? So coming into contact with Decolonize This Place and some of the facilitating work they've been doing, connecting all these different struggles, I started participating in these actions, and I started learning how these museums, which are sites where you learn how to behave in accordance with these kinds of models of surveillance and control that you internalize. So if the museum is a place you can go to learn how to be a law-abiding citizen, how to be part of this machine, the Decolonize This Place has helped me see how you can go to these spaces to learn how to resist those exact logics. I want to be able to take that into my work in museums and art spaces and be able to make art spaces places for connection and not for atomization, not for ways, not places where we become individualized and pieces of a larger machinery. Some place where we can remember how to come together and make those connections once again, right? Make connections that are outside the state, outside of capitalism, and outside of forces that try to pit us against each other, right? I want to start conversations and start doing that facilitation, start doing that work that makes these spaces productive for life-giving work, because that's what we're all doing here. That's the work that we're engaged in. And so I'm really interested in being able to, that energy that we had in New York, I would really like to be able to bring that here. Some of it I think is talking between the struggles, making common spaces, making spaces where we can see where those logics, those structures of control and colonialism, places where we can see how they're happening, like the monument struggles have done for us, right? All those monument struggles have shown us how these structures of control are there in public spaces and how we can resist them. And so, yeah, thanks very much. That's what I would like to talk about today. Miigwech.
Thank you so much. And now I want to pass it on to Brittany and Ben. And I just want to say that, like, Brittany and Ben are two special people, but I know Brittany from the first action DTP ever did before it was DTP. And I remember getting on the phone with Brittany and saying, listen, you put out this thing on Medium and we're planning on going over there. What do you got to share? What do you got to say? So I'm just putting that on the map as like really a resonance of like institutions as sites of struggle and transformation and movement building, in which we kind of all were thinking about it around the same time. And we were just fortunate enough to, through actions, find each other. Britt.
Wow, absolutely. I remember that. I remember talking with you. I think for me, thank you for bringing it up. I mean, and sitting with me in a different space now. What's coming to me, I'm a movement artist and I'm a part of a collective called Get This War Dance. We're just looking at Black dances as war dances. Since we've been here on stolen land, we have been at war, we have been at genocide, and we have experienced violence over and over and over again, right? And so when we're talking about museums and we're talking about objects being stolen and we're talking about the Black body also being looked at as an object, then we see the connections around how white supremacy, all these different layers of isms continue to strip and violate us over and over and over again. And so, like, thinking about DTP's work, when we know that the art world is the place where they wash their money, just like they whitewash our bodies, whitewash our culture, and put it on consumption for capitalism, period, right? And so thinking about the disembodiment and what lies beyond liberation, what I've been thinking about in this moment is liberation is colonized at this point. What's beyond it, right? Given that our bodies have been stolen, we have been fighting many different battles. I beg the question around like our imaginations. Is it really enough to dream us out of our realities, or do we really need to have an embodied practice? What is that embodied knowledge in our bodies that our ancestors gave us? You know, like people talk about Harriet Tubman all the time, but I'm on a riff now, but like Harriet Tubman dreamed because she know the ancestors was giving her that some information, right? The dances before you go into war, there are war dances. Those things call upon what was before us and what will be after us. So how I'm entering this space with DTP is looking at the museum the same way that I'm looking at this embodied practice of dancing, because together they're like, we continue to separate art, but together it tells a different story about our power that's in our bodies, but the power that we can produce, process, however you want to call it, to get beyond liberation, and down into some runage and some deep work and building collectively. And I'm gonna pass it to Ben. Me and Ben, we work together on so many different projects. Yeah, I'll let him introduce himself.
Thank you for that, Brittany. Hey everybody, sorry for the wait. Of course, I put the wrong time on my schedule, but I'm here, ready and present. Thank you all for putting this all together and bring this all together. I think everybody covered everything. I'm here for us to think and reflect and strategize towards the directions we need to go. We got to build with each other. We got to create whatever we need to create. We got to create it, and then transition to the next level. Always evolving, always being creative. So I'm excited to participate in the conversation. I'll pass it to whoever is next or whoever is willing and able.
Before we let you off the hook, Ben and Britt, I think it's important just to I'm kind of just bringing a couple of things out with these questions, and you can choose to ignore them or not. And I think the same goes for Shailene. Just because they come from these struggles in the city, Shailene was one of the people that kind of said at some point, DTP has done enough in the world or of museums, and perhaps it can learn something by pivoting to the city, right? So that that's one point I want to bring up as not as sites of struggle and not specific, but what was your thinking behind that? Because I think it informs what happens. And I think for Britt and Ben, y'all really kind of pay attention to the money. And I think that you also were instrumental in us paying attention to the Ford Foundation. And so, thinking about the pivot to the city coupled with, the Ford Foundation as money. And I would say this, I think part of what's in the room right now is a conversation around decolonization and abolition and anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism. And so your thoughts from your place around that is really important. We're not limiting it to museums, we're thinking about an analysis.
I can answer if y'all not ready. All right. Again, more incoherent thoughts, but I think to answer your question, like when I was saying this thing about like New York being a contested space, like, and why the museums matter and why pivoting to the city, the pivot to the city is really, the museum is the city. You know what I'm saying? The museum actually is the city. You know what I'm saying? What I'm thinking about is actually connects to the Ford Foundation also. You see, when I say New York is like a contested space, and what I mean is that when this flip to the neoliberal kind of reorg of New York happens, it happens at the same time as the counterintelligence program. You see what I'm saying? Like there is a flooding of not just like the dog whistle to the cultural to the professionalized artists and the people who want to Frank Sinatra made New York in 1985. People don't know that. People think that shit was made in the 50s, but that shit was made in 1985. So I say that to say there is a calling of people into New York, many sectors. We made the mistake for a long time, I think, to just think about it in terms of art washing and artists only. But, you know, looking past the artists or looking past the real estate, we have to look at colleges, and we have to look at how universities, you know, pull in an array of sectors, including the nonprofit industrial complex. You know what I'm saying? So then what we have on the ground is an upgraded, like, replacement labor pool of people who are very ambitious, who are in the city and in the space, and they don't have a context of the standoff that I mentioned before. That context is missing. You see what I'm saying? And so for us, the fight ends up kind of being like, we gotta fight people with no context who came here for ambitious, upwardly mobile reasons. You see what I'm saying? To get to what the actual issue is, which is Darren Walker throwing, how much money was it, Brittany? Like, bro, listen, in the height of the George Floyd protests,
he put down $1 billion.
$1 billion in social bonds to anybody. He framed it under COVID related, but it was social, but it was for social justice initiatives. They're constantly flooding the city with their own initiatives. You see what I'm saying? Like, which what that actually means is like, okay, y'all want to do social justice work? Well, here is a framework for you to do it that we allow and fund for you. And that operates as a snuffing tool for local grassroots. So our work with DTP got around that shit. You see what I'm saying? And there were problems present on the ground once we did that. You see what I'm saying? Like, once we asked DTP to pivot outside of the museum, we saw the same behavior as we saw in the museum. When we went to the Whitney, in the very beginning, because I was part of those conversations, we said, look, when they released the names of everybody who was going to be in the biennial, we saw it. It was like it was human shields. It was like, this is going to be a Black biennial. That was in reaction to the Dana Schutt shit 2 years ago. So their PR firm was like, you better make this a Black biennial. That way you can fucking get around critique. Now, that's not to say that we don't deserve our day in court. Currently, currently the BX is like constructing the hip hop museum. All of like the pioneers are part of this. So like, you know, it's like the authentic, genuine desire, because you care about this, to like be seen, and like not to be seen, but like to archive and hold on and like conserve the history, the culture, weaponized. So you know what I'm saying? So to say that is to say, like, yes, Black artists are like, you know, our cultural expression should be seen, but the museum is a fucking sneaky asshole. What they do is they're sneaky assholes, right? That was PR. So of course the conversation is like, all right, we see this list, we know what's gonna happen. Reach out to artists, as many as you can, and let them know, look, this is not about the artists. This is something else. These motherfuckers, y'all know the situation, and the rest is history. But despite that fact, what we encounter over and over and over and over again is like a fucking broken record, is the strike breakers, and the fight, and the union, and the boss gets away with murder. So then you end up in like unnecessary conflict with artists who feel like personally attacked. Really, that shit is just cognitive dissonance. You know what I'm saying? But like, you know, you end up in this like unnecessary like bickering. Meanwhile, this dude is sitting pretty. You see what I'm saying? So like when we move outside of the museum, we encounter the same shit. you encounter nonprofits who are like, that's not the way you protest. And like, you encounter like people who have their own vision of what they think New York is, of what they think the community is, because I'm so sick of this word community. What fucking community are you talking about? Whose community are you talking about? Let's be clear here, you know what I'm saying? You encounter these kinds of walls. And that is why I think that this is a really important conversation. We need to go back and look at why this is like this pattern, and who are the players, why, like what is the ideas and the feelings behind that shit that continues to like make this replicate itself. You know, like, you know, the fucking excuse me, sorry, I'm swearing so much. You know, like the pivot to the street and how nonprofits and other leftist cliques or whatever, you know what I'm saying? Like this struggle for power that happened on the street, that shit was just basically like a regurgitation of how the museum acts. It's like a weird defensive thing. It's about like, it's about power, and it's something that needs to be unpacked and cleared up and looked at very well, so that we can try to get around that shit, because this is New York, is always going to continue to happen. And you know, I often say that I'm probably going to end up exiled out of fucking New York if I keep talking all this shit. You know what I'm saying? So like, y'all need any help thinking about this shit, where you at, let me know. Cause yeah, man, you know what I'm saying? Like maybe New York is not the site to do this in. We're like 10 miles away from the, you know what I'm saying? We're like 10 miles away from Wall Street, man. They're gonna just continue to reproduce fighting bodies for us through like liberal multiculturalism. You know what I'm saying? Like they will just continue to double down on representation. And you know, like, yo, the colonized mind is a fucking hard thing to break, bro.
I got a couple things I want to add to what Shailene was saying. You hit it right on the head. I wrote something up talking about Black dance artists, and what just is resonating with me is like, can be applied here. It's like, is there a difference between a house nigga and a field nigga, or are we still niggas in the world of grant making, waiting for them to give us permission to create? And I think that's one. The second thing is that the Ford Foundation specifically created the New York Police Foundation, which is actually these are the this foundation on their board is the targets, it's the Bloombergs, it's the people who, you know, the corporations and the wealthiest people in the world on the board. But this foundation also had work with Israel, works with all of the Western colonizers and police foundations in the world, right? They have bases across the globe. And who set it up? Ford Foundation. Ford Foundation also set up the network of police units and whatever. They set up these surveillance technology. Oh, and the other thing I will say is they were set up, I think in the 70s and 80s during the original hot summers. And you can go on their website and they will tell you it was set up to prevent uprisings and riots from happening again, right? So when you look at having large corporations on the board and you look at why they set up, then the question becomes, well, it's not even a question, it's very clear around police being here to protect wealthy people. And in New York City, what this means is that New York has always been a testing ground for surveillance. And so when you talk about, I'm not from New York City, but when I organize in New York City, I'm with people from New York because they have lived through this, right? Over and over and over and over and over again. So I think that is one of the biggest things that needs to set with us. And so when we looked at following the money, and we all came together to call out Ford Foundation, what we realized is it's not just Ford Foundation. Just think about it this, like, the museum is another form of plantation, right? They give us in return, and also too, when we talk about gentrification, but we don't talk about the inflation process that happens as well, along with gentrification, that is down to all of our depletes all of our resources completely in our communities. And I'm saying, like, we talk about inflation as money, but inflation as culture, inflation as Black restaurants or community things that were there and is not there anymore. So, like, this type of violence continues to happen. I had one more point, but I can't remember.
We'll come to you.
Yeah. So just those things right there around, like, hey, we really need to take a look at the grant making process, because that, like, they're basically telling you, if you don't do this, they're setting the guidelines around how much risk you can take, how much, money you can get if you are in their spectrum of thinking. And so how do you break that shit down, destroy it, and continue to do other things? Like, what is the disruption? Even if you apply for it, I'm going off on the riff, like, even if you're applying for grants and you're doing this and be like, oh, fuck that, I'm doing something else, to continue to disrupt these processes as much as possible.
Thank you for that, Brittany. And if you remember that other last point, just jump in at any point. So I'm gonna make some broad statements, and they're gonna sound wild and inflammatory, but they're gonna just be what I'm thinking at this moment. So one of the things that people always like to say is that Black people have an oral culture. And they even extend that to say people of color have an oral culture. And there's a certain level of disrespect that is associated with that, because they're trying to say we're artistic and spiritual, and we have these deep connections with each other, which is true on a certain level. There's a lot of truth to that. But as a Black person, as an African, one of the things I want Black people to know that, we are the first people. So what that means is that we invented writing. We invented all of these, like, these things aren't a big deal to us. We've just been doing it for so long. We don't obsess over them, right? So they give us a one-dimensional view of ourselves. So we think, oh, okay, I can't do research and critique and analyze and be scientific and all the. No, we invented those things, right? I can send you links to caves in the Congo where you see high-level math being done by villages, right? I come from a place where people were doing abortions and anesthesiology thousands of years before those words were even defined in the West, right? So we've been doing that shit. So what does that relate to this moment? The systems that we're confronting, a lot of them basically originate from Western Europe and Western civilization, right? And the reality is if you understand their history, what you find is a lot of them actually, they learned how to write very recently, right? England didn't have a written a script. They took that from the Romans, the French, all of those. The Spanish actually saw writing and all of those things from the Romans, and also saw Black people and Moors writing, and then they rejected science and became super religious, right? As a rejection of those things, right? But the French, the English, all of those people who then created the US that we understand, they're obsessed with writing. They see themselves as the epitome of civilization, right? What that means for us is that everything is documented. There's a document for everything. There's a trail somewhere. If you're trying to figure out something, if I'm the manager of your store and you're trying to figure out if you see an organization that's doing supposed good work, but you're thinking they're a little funny, there's a money trail and a documentation trail somewhere that will articulate what you're talking about, because all of it is you know, it's part of that culture of becoming very scientific and writing. They become one dimensional. They obsess about the written text, which really is no more powerful than the oral text, right? They're not much different, right? And also the lesson for us also as well is that our previous movements, when we're talking about civil rights, we're talking about Black power in the US context and really around the world, but like we just focus on the US, is we want a lot of things. We want those folks are the reasons why we're alive, but we also, one of the things, the deceptive things we want is we want politeness from the system. So a lot of things that Brittany's talking about, where they're back in the day, they'll say, we're creating this foundation to disrupt movement. They're never gonna ever say that ever again. That's done. You're not gonna see documents past 1975 saying that type of language. What they're gonna say is the opposite. They're gonna say, they learned, hey, you can't really walk up to a Black person and disrespect them to their face. Because that's what that was the previous system. The previous system was upfront, honest, to your face. Now they're like, you can't do that. Right, and the tension within the white power structure is between a group that wants to go back to being honest and a group that doesn't like that it's embarrassing. So Trump is an embarrassment to about 60 to 70% of the white power structure. And there's a 20, 30% that's like, nah, that's our guy. We fuck with that old school regular shit where you just tell Mexicans what they are, you tell women what they are, you just be real. And it's like, oh, okay, that's some wild shit, but that's the truth. He's telling the truth. And they fuck with that. So, but again, he's a minority in the power structure in a certain way. So the system is polite, but everything now though is hidden within documents. So if you peel the layers of the documents and the money, then you'll see, oh, this is what you're really saying. So up front, you know, all of us, whether you work in a nonprofit, municipal government, private sector, whatever branch of the system, your civic society you're working in, is never going to the hospitals aren't going to say, our goal is to make sure Black people don't live past 65. Like, no one would say that. But if you look at the documentation, you start to realize, wait, you have created a system that will create this outcome. Like, it's predictable, right? And in 65 and 68, you were honest about it. Then around 71, 72, 73, you stop being honest about it. But then you see the documentation, the same people who run the system still run the system. They just put a lot of shell companies in the way. So that's the dynamic we're in. And so what our responsibility now is like, it's time to be serious. Like, it's time to be serious. Like, all the money is blood money. And it's time to be a serious, do the work in a serious way. We can't afford to be stupid. Like, we can't afford to be like, oh, I don't know. Wait, what's happening? No, you got to know. You got to know the shit and operate with a clear understanding and a clear analysis. Be scientific with it and spiritual with it. And in fact, that dichotomy, again, that's white people's structure. Like, scientific and spirituality, it's one and the same. So you got to move with that synergy and that understanding, right? You can be secular and spiritual at the same time if you need to be. And just for example, to show you just how simple it is that the money is everywhere. Like, everything is blood money. Like, if everyone was to, if you all put your phone to your screen, unless you're using your actual phone, every phone, if you're holding your phone, if you're touching your laptop, every phone, the raw materials to make this phone come from the Congo, right? The coltan, the cobalt, all of that comes from the Congo. And damn near all of the technology that we have comes from Africa, from the Congo, as in there are children and people who are going into mines and digging up out of the ground, right? And much of this is enforced forced labor, you know, slavery, what have you, that is present with us. So this idea that Black death and this thing is a myth and it's far away. No, every time you touch your phone, you touch Africa, right? And particularly for Black people, you gotta realize that you never, Africa is always gonna be there. The minute you touch it, you touch your phone, you're touching Africa. So you understand that, not only just to understand the level of the system and the violence, but also understand that the connection is alive. That some child dug up your phone and that child looks like your cousin, and that child is part of a critical movement in their place, and they're waiting for you to get online to your shit. So your struggle, whatever it is, so the nature of your system is the oppression here in New York City or in wherever you're at is, I'm gonna work you to death so you can barely afford this phone. Right? So you got to wait for the update. Whereas the oppression out the other way is, you don't even know that you're digging up a phone. You just know that you forced to dig up a phone. And so, and our role then is to make that connection and the document. In 65, they would have just been honest. Hey, yo, we got this shit from over here. When we dropped the bomb, atomic bomb, they said the reason the US was able to drop the atomic bomb is because they controlled the Congo and they were able to dig out the minerals from there and create the atomic bomb, right? So everything major event in world history, Africa and Black people were central to it being possible, right? And so our thinking has to understand that we're always connected, and also the system is, we are, our death and our blood is at the heart of everything that the system does. And then given that, given that you understand that now, it's like, what I show you something as simple as your phone. Now think about it, whether you're working at a municipal space, you city agency, all of these outposts at a nonprofit, or you're working in the private sector, or you freelancing, or whatever you're doing. Every system you're interfacing with it, if you peel the layers, like maybe only 1 or 2 layers back as far as documentation, you start to look who's on the board, who gives the money, who does, and then you start to see the truth, right? Ignore the mission statement. The mission statement is always going to be positive because they learned not to be disrespectful to people to their face. So they're never going to be fuck you, da 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 da. Never again. They know that's stupid. Trump, excuse Trump. He's the bad black sheep of the family. But as far as the broader system, they're never going to do that shit no more. But if you just peel back the layers, what you find out is, hey, the person who runs your city agency where you work in hospital services or whatever, they own the museum. But in the museum is the artistic space to make them look like a good person. But then at the same time, they will run weapons manufacturing and they dropping bombs in Yemen right now. That's how that shit works. Now, everybody knows the Yemen bombing shit is going to be the shit that no one wants to hear about. But what you hear about is the hospital, and what you hear is about is the museum. And so your role is to see, okay, this is the game y'all playing, and to deconstruct that and make it very simple. And yeah, so this is all possible. Like everyone can see this stuff if you just take a few seconds to reflect. It doesn't take a super genius, super smart. In fact, that's one of the lies they tell us, is that you got to go to their schools and learn how to be to be able to do this. And I was brainwashed into that, and then slowly coming out of that, understanding, oh, yo, I could have figured this stuff out on my own. So that's where I'm at with that. Yeah, that's all on my end as far as the research and how this should move.
Thank you, Ben. I want to kind of circle back now through Maria, Jason, Mikinak, and then open it up to us for thoughts. So going backwards in the same way, things that you want to share or bring into the room in light of, just keep the conversation going. Mikinak, do you really enjoyed first? Or Jason, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just started speaking. I apologize. I really enjoyed what everyone said, and I feel like there's a certain level of us all already knowing a lot of this, but needing to be reminded that these are things that we need to address and come through in our daily lives, rather than just bringing them to the fore when we're asked to, as opposed to bringing it to the fore without necessarily asking permission. So thanks for that.
Mikinak?
Yeah, I'm grateful to everyone, and I'm energized by the way that we're taking this from the idea of art spaces to the world, right? Where are all those interconnections going? They're not just going to the people next door or whatever. It's because we lived in this political climate, because we live in this world that came about through colonization, came about through extraction. All our relations sometimes are on the other end of a very fraught, line of connection. The phones that we hold in our hand, that is a very fraught connection, but it is a connection to someone that we're responsible to. On the other end of it, we are responsible to those people, and those responsibilities go much further than they used to, but they're still important. We have to think about all of those when if we're going to be conducting ourselves ethically in this land, in this place. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just mirror that as well. This idea of, it comes back to relationship building. I think that's something that New York really emphasized to me, is how much that direct person-to-person contact is, and that's something also that reminds me and brings me back to my community and my family as well, that was something like, who are you, where are you from, knowing all this information as a way to be accountable, right? Who's in the room with you, knowing the room, and just returning to that idea of ethical accountability together. I think that's really important. And like Mick said, when we think of our relations, there's us, but we also have many other relations. We have the water, our relations with the water, with the sky, with the land, with the trees, with the fish, with the birds, you know, all of these relations that often get left out. And, you know, I remember being part of, you know, Jason and I were part of this racial imaginary event. And, you know, they talked about it being about whiteness. And I'm like, at the end of the day, we're like, this isn't about whiteness. This is about anti-Blackness. And if you want to talk about whiteness, you can't leave out Indigenous people as well. We have to go back and include the genocide that's happened on the very land that we're on. So it's great to see a lot of progress happening on both sides of the Canadian-US border, I think in Mexico, you know, constantly being aware of the issue that in Mexico, you know, Jason reminds me that the brown people who are the Mexicans are Indigenous as well, which isn't acknowledged in Canada when we look at who are our Indigenous colleagues. You know, they're always looking to the colonial, like the other parts of the Commonwealth, New Zealand and Australia. So I think really opening up what this is, whether, you know, with Ben talking about, are we talking about Black Indigenous, right? Are we talking about Black America? What are all these ways that we want to define ourselves and connect?
Thank you. I think that, you know, part of the conversation now, I want to bring it to the MTL folks and see what can they bring into the room. But part of us thinking about museums is that it came from like our movements with Occupy and the failures and lessons learned of not acknowledging that we're on stolen land, even though many of us weren't raised here. So that's kind of a learning process and progress. And so then when the movement got crushed and we, you know, started doing other things, we focused on institutions as sites that can offer a little buffer and provide more leverage. So for us, the idea of going, for example, to the Guggenheim or whatever, it's us, we're artists and whatever, but we know these things that they claim, not their mission statement, what they claim in their mission statement is antithetical to what their function is in the world. And so it was a site of, to go and struggle, but also it's not to struggle against, that's a byproduct, but the transformation of finding each other and building power and training in the practice of freedom is what we were kind of doing as we found each other. And I think that the pivot to the city is like, it was always part of that logic, right? And that the moment called for. And I think we're in a moment right now where one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, why did the George Floyd moment, after so many years of building, get crushed so quickly? In one respect, it's always learning, it's always growing. These are relations, it's a win, there's no question. But the counterinsurgency was so strong. And so when we are talking and having this conversation now, I'm reminded by the importance of hitting these institutions that offer us proximity to the motherfuckers. And so with that, I just want to kind of pass it on to MTL people.
I just wanted to make a point specifically for people who are watching that we're actually going to extend beyond 1:30. So just as a point of information.
Mars, Kyle, Amy, if you have anything, Andrew, Yates, Crystal, don't be shy.
Yeah, I can say something. Just really quickly, kind of building off of what's been in the room, but I think that the relationships that we build in our movements are definitely key. We talked about creating other worlds within and yet outside of white supremacy, patriarchy, imperialism, and capitalism. But I think what we're all kind of noting is that people who enter these new worlds like to bring worldly bullshit with them into these spaces, right? And so, and by that, what does that look like? Sometimes people spend so much time reaching for vertical power and money that they forget the horizontal power and the debts that we owe each other, right? Which is something Amin is always saying. So it's literally just like, we're creating these new worlds and you're bringing your worldly bootstraps in here to pull up in front of all of our faces, right? And that's the nonprofits, that's the people at universities, that's the gentrifiers, that's all of that. But they so badly, like in their hearts, know that the system is fucking them up too, to kind of channel Fred Moten a little bit. And yet they still are kind of bringing some of these worldly ways into it. And I think that's one reason why the George Floyd uprisings were crushed so simply and so easily, is because, one, as Britt noted, the nonprofits, or well, Britt has noted over the months I've known her, or the years I've known her, that the nonprofits, they were preparing for the past since 2014 with ways to counterinsurgency, to stymie growth out in the streets. They came out with their leaders, and then people who were dreaming of other worlds but still doing worldly bullshit went to those protests, and it just compounded from there. And there was a lot of loss. So there was a lot of people who didn't really know what to do next. And I think confusion is what gets commodified and like thrown out as like, oh, good. But yeah, I would just say that, how do we break the cycle that people have been talking about earlier? How do we get people to imagine worlds otherwise? And while imagining worlds otherwise, how do we get people to kind of let go of some of the habits that they learn? And maybe it's because those habits bring some sort of temporary security in the world right now, or at least it seems like it brings temporary security, perhaps in the form of a paycheck, or some sort of prestige. But I just, I hope that we can get to a place where people see beyond that, and get to a place where people understand that paycheck and that prestige is crumbs compared to the table we could build and the feast that we could have.
Thank you, Mars. That's wonderful. Amy, Kyle, Yates.
I'll just add, I think, thinking about our work in terms of the city, I think the Ford Foundation becomes a really crucial moment, because it was a public moment where the Ford Foundation was being weaponized, its money and the arts that they support, to basically legitimize the building of new jails. And so, back to your question about why the George Floyd uprising was so squashed, the Ford Foundation, there's a history there of doing that kind of work, of squashing rebellion with their Ford Foundation money. So I think for us, pivoting into the city through the Ford Foundation, I think was a really kind of important moment, because it was, the Ford Foundation's almost the holy grail. You don't question, you don't critique. And they were basically, weaponizing their foundation to build new jails, and really pushing that as like how they were legitimizing that through the arts and through that kind of money. Charlene was just talking about $1 billion they were trying to give, or they're giving, to social justice work through the arts. So, for me and for the work we're doing, that right there was the moment where we see it fully connected in public view. So I just want to add that I think it was, in terms of us pivoting to the city, that was a crucial moment.
It also reminds me, just to make the connection, like the Ford Foundation's relationship to museums. And when Warren Kanders resigned from the Whitney board, it was reported in the New York Times that they met with Darren Walker, undisclosed directors of museums, probably to think about the future of philanthropy. And I'm seeing this idea of philanthropy and inclusion and all this stuff as really a logic of counterinsurgency at this moment. Equity, all this kind of stuff, which has already been brought up, but I think it's good to kind of see these connections. Amy, Yates, Andrew.
Well, I have a brief comment. It's more of a structural one, and it's really somewhere in between Shalene's description of DTP as rattling the cage, which I liked, and what Ben was arguing for, which is more of a building, sort of more of a programmatic knowledge base. And I mean, I've always thought of DTP as a catalyst. Catalysts make, they make chemical reactions happen, and sometimes they're quite explosive chemical reactions. Other times not. But we don't have the resources or the structure really to direct where that chemistry goes and frame it in the directions that we would like that to happen. And I think this is I think it's a question for us and for everyone really on this call about whether it is actually our job to build something more programmatic, given the limited resources and the kinds of skills that we have. Just to give one example, we've always talked about, and we've always called for a decolonization commission, all right, in our work with museums. We've never put together a blueprint for decolonization commission. I mean, I think in part, not just because of our limited resources, but also because as a matter of strategy, we're undecided about whether actually that is our role and our function, to be building that kind of structure as opposed to operating, more in the catalyst role or the rattling the cages role. We don't get to the point where we're actually, moving the cages around. We open them, but we can't eliminate them. And at some point, I think we have to ask ourselves to operate within the limits of our strength and our skills, and to keep things tight, as opposed to, reaching beyond what we're capable of doing, or not. That seems to me to be a conversation about, movement building from our perspective that is ongoing. But in the course of the next, several weeks with these conversations, perhaps could be directed more towards what's happening on the ground in Ontario, because one of the reasons we took on this show really was to help make connections and to amplify what we could by being, virtually or in the ground in Ontario itself.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you. Who wants to go next? Nit?
Amy, go ahead.
Amy.
I mean, I feel like so much has been said already that I don't want to just repeat the same things, but I feel like one thing that something I've been thinking about a lot and sticks out to me is the mentioning of being able to actually touch the line of struggles, right? And reconnect with these lines of struggles that go beyond just our worlds, our little worlds that we inhabit right now, and go beyond. So really thinking about we're in the midst of COVID and everyone is in these little bubbles that get formed, but and then mutual aid became a really big thing, and seeing the importance of that, but also really trying to realize what that means, what mutual aid means, because it's not just about getting nonprofits to give a one-time, what the Brooklyn Museum did, oh, we'll do lunch boxes once a week or not even for a month, or they'll open their bathrooms to people who were protesting, but I'm how come they didn't give their space, so thinking about how in mutual aid, we're also refusing what is, you know, as we're trying to build, and we're really trying to embody this, right? So really thinking about how our body-based senses are all also a part of this, and how that actually builds for us to really see each other and then create something new. And so, like, I mean, I just have to say I appreciate being here with you all to plot, you know, because, like, you know, that's what we're doing, we're plotting. And yeah, I really appreciate that.
Yates?
I really appreciated Ben's point about, like, everything has a document, right? And that sometimes that can take the form of written documents in a, you know, in a colonial institution or a corporate institution, but there's lots of other ways too that things can become documents that we can see in new ways, like that shift of perspective that Ben did when talking about our phones and the devices that we're talking about. I feel like that's what's happened with the museums, is that kind of that shifting of the lens and the orientation, so that we can, like, read all these things as documents. And it reminds me of the research that people did, and I know that you know, that for Mikinak and other scholars and organizers, like, really going into the archives of places like the AMNH, and the way in which that research then becomes a kind of prism for the struggles to come together, and that not to just be a paper or a policy, but to be this embodied action that does that cage rattling, but also creates the space for alternatives. And I think that process of the document trails, whether it be in actual archives or whether it be in testimonies or whether it be in objects, I feel like that is that scholars and organizers have done that so much, and are in the process now with these institutions that have very, let's say, explicit colonial histories, but that modern and contemporary art museums are part of that same historical continuum. And there's a lot of people's research and document reading and researching that I think could happen and has already started to happen at a lot of other places. And in many cases, this stuff is hiding in plain sight. It's just shining a light on it and having that angle that Ben brought. And so just kind of thinking about what kind of popular research initiatives, how we can continue to extend those and expand them to different places. And working in this formation and with these kind of groups and networks of folks, we know that it never just goes into something academic or something that's just contained in the frame of something an institution is doing. That's what's been amazing, is to see the operationalization of knowledge, of research, of reading, and enacting that truth with our bodies and in spaces and in ways that actually can make a change. So yeah, I think there's a lot more that we can do with archives, building on the work that so many scholars and organizers have already done. But I think with each new document that we look in with that new perspective, it becomes, you know, it's almost like their archives are our receipts in a certain type of way, you know? And so what does that mean for, you know, for actual, you know, being able to leave the terms of the institution to create something else, but doing it in such a way that we don't just, when we say forget the institution, it also means drill down on that institution in new ways, but without recognizing its authority, and to set the terms in the way everybody was describing with the Ford Foundation, with the nonprofits, with all the initiatives that are happening at museums. There's a lot we can do when we do it autonomously, which does not take away from also in some cases working within them in various ways in the way that Mikinak was describing, but I think it's probably specific to what institution you're talking about. Because look, here we are being hosted by Guelph, and having a really great collaborator in Sally, for example, within an institution. So the site specificity of which institutions we're talking about, I think also matters in terms of how we make things operational.
Yeah, let's hear from Jason and then go to you. Yeah.
So thank you. It's been noted a couple of times that what we're actually up against is a network, but I want to be a little more granular with that. From personal experience is that what you'll often find in New York City is you have board members of large arts institutions who are also board members of smaller institutions. And what will happen is when they're the smaller institutions, which have a more, I don't know, I guess, a different way of operating, less bureaucratic, they will begin to gather momentum for trying to make changes in their institutions or support changing in other institutions. For example, the American Museum, I keep calling it AMNH because that's all I know of, American Museum of Natural History. But then the director will say, well, someone from the board of the AMNH will also be on the board of the smaller organization on Museum Mile or down. And then that support will be quashed because they cannot upset that board from AMNH. And so this happens a lot. And so I'm wondering, with the support, with the hosting that we have in Guelph, I wonder who is on the board of Guelph that would also be on the board of a larger institution that would probably, had they, you know, if DTP had done activities there, if this would have been quashed at Guelph, for example. And I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done for finding out this network and getting around them. Or when you oust a board member from, or you seek to oust a board member from a large organization, also making sure that it's publicized of these smaller organizations that they have an imbalanced impact at.
I think
Sorry,
Sally has something to.
I'm just going to interject here. Thanks, Natasha. I've just got a message from our director, and our board, the AGG board, is not composed that way. This is not defensiveness. This is just for the sake of clarity. So we don't necessarily have those sort of direct complications or entanglements in that way.
But the building where the museum is.
Yes. I'm going to be silent again.
I think we can, but I mean, the building where
feel free to bring that up.
Yeah, I mean, Sally, why don't you mention it and then I can continue just so that I'm accurate. Like, can you mention what the building was historically?
No, but it's in the manual.
Okay.
It could just be dropped in the manual. Yates, do you want to?
Yeah, I can say a little bit, but also I wonder if folks who know more about the history of oligarchic philanthropy and settler state building in Canada could weigh in on it. But the building, I believe, it was started by the MacDonalds. And it was a school for bringing, I think it was white settlers from rural areas to, and I apologize if this is to like a metropolitan like educational thing, but the MacDonalds were, they built their fortune selling tobacco from the southern United States in Canada. So they were able to go around. It was basically like during the Civil War, they figured out a mechanism to be able to still profit off of the plantation system, and that was kind of like the nucleus of the money. And then the MacDonalds became one of the main philanthropists in building up the settler education system in Canada. If anybody else has others to add to that, by all means, but I'm pretty sure.
Sally, go ahead.
I was just going to read the passage from the manual that references that, because I apologize. I'm not well versed enough on the history to sort of summarize it right here, but it's true what you're mentioning. So this is the passage here. Along with stolen land, the wealth at the origins of the Art Gallery of Guelph also derives in part from the enslavement of African people. Philanthropist Sir William MacDonald built his fortune importing tobacco from the Confederate States during the Civil War. MacDonald was instrumental in creating the settler education system in Canada, including the MacDonald Consolidated School, which was the identity of this building before it was converted into the MacDonald Stewart Art Center in 1978. And but the other the other thing to just briefly mention is that the Art Gallery of Guelph, the architecture, is entangled with the residential school system here. And I'm not, someone is, okay, I'm going to ignore that just for now. But it is entangled with the sort of genocide, this sort of cultural genocide of indigenous people, even if that is mainly articulated on an architectural plane.
Maria, did you have anything to add to that? All right. Anyone else? And Natasha, you were going to say something, and then I can wrap it up.
But I mean, yeah, it was it kind of went into a different direction, but I'll still bring it up. I think the thing that we don't talk about much is also the weaponization of aesthetics in this whole project of, you know, settler colonization, or like all of this, because you know, I think like, you know, like you mentioned, Nick and Ek, like the role of the museum in terms of building the citizen or the state, like, you know, somebody who's part of a state or a citizenship, it's so deeply tied to the aesthetics that these institutions produce. And they also kind of are so tied to this idea of what even counts as a human being, right? If you bring Fanon into this, like Fanon one-on-one, like, you know, black skin, white mask, or any of these, you know, different kind of the role of aesthetics that is built into it. Because I think if we really talk about that, then all this conversation about diversity, equity, or having a black biennial or a people of color biennial or a gendered biennial or all of that is like, it's part of the same system, right? And I think it's important to understand that even on the level of aesthetics, and by aesthetics, I just don't mean beauty or like seeing like beautiful shit on the wall. It's the way we sense the world. It's our entire senses that we're talking about. So when we talk about embodied practices within our movements or within our institutions, I think that the role of the aesthetics is highly weaponized, right? What counts as art? What doesn't count as art, right? That's like, you know, talking as DTP, often people are like, oh, you're just activists, right? And we don't like the term activist because it's a specialization of something that, you know, shouldn't be a specialized role, right? So, you know, we're organizers, we're artists, we're human beings, we're people, we're just trying to rattle the cages, as Charlene said. So I mean, I think the role of the aesthetics is really important. And then the other thing that I think I deeply learned specifically from, you know, indigenous struggles, both in the United States, but also here back home in India, is the project against assimilation, and how that is really important. And I think that, like, you know, the more I've been thinking about, like, what are the kind of lines that can be drawn, which are, you know, built for building relations between this abolitionist, decolonial, anti-imperialist kind of struggle, is being against the project of assimilation. And that includes development, progress, modernity, diversity, equity, like, you know, civic projects, architecture, archives. You can put anything under that, like, because, you know, all of it comes from that structure that we've been living. And it's not just easy to say that it's just a Western project at this point. And I think that places like, you know, India offer a really good example of that, where you have, you know, decades of, like, I mean, centuries of history, which is also fascist, which is also, you know, also like has been a source of oppression for years. And so I think that, you know, as I think as Brittany mentioned, like, when liberation has become a colonized project, right? What is the project of liberation against assimilation? Like, I think that's another, like, you know, like, it's something that I'm thinking about. And then just like, you know, I was just thinking about, Andrew, like your point about, like, what can we do? I feel like so much of our time just goes into holding, like, you know, like around the Whitney Museum, right? That's a good example. The 9 weeks of Art in Action. We went every freaking Friday to kind of like rattle the cages, to talk about Palestine, to talk about Puerto Rico, to talk about Kashmir, to talk about Tijuana, to talk about, you know, NYPD, to talk about Ferguson, to talk about like to Sudan. Like, every single Friday we went. But what was communicated? Oh, they just want Candors out. That's it. So when Candors is out, that's the win. We won, right? Did we really win? And I mean, this was a question we were asking even at that time. And I think this is really important to think about, specifically not just for DTP, but as like art movements or movements amongst the city. It's not just about bad money, good money, one board member, that member, this, you know, we're talking about the whole freaking goddamn structure that needs to go. Right? So it's not that we need a Black curator or a South Asian curator for a South Asian museum. That shit should be like striked from the get-go. And I think that's like, you know, and I think like one thing that I was thinking about, which I heard Fred talk about, and that's something that, specifically thinking about, the kind of lines between abolition and decolonization, but also anti-imperialism, is how do we build projects that are against ownership? And how do we abolish the idea of ownership, right? And like, how do we actually think about that in our relationships? And how do we actually communicate that through our actions that we're even trying to do, even on a small scale? And so, I think for me personally, one of the things that I, realized from the Whitney stuff is that we should have began from decolonization and abolition from the get-go, thinking about, let's begin from the crisis of what the Candace Project is, hoping that it would translate over time, that, we would be like pedagogy, transformation, thresholds, all of these things would kind of come together and people would see how these issues are connected, right? And the thing that we haven't brought in is Palestine, like how that was such a huge pivot, central point to the organizing around Whitney, and how that's always something that throws a wrench, and it also causes counterinsurgency, all of these things. Like, we're still facing the repercussions of a lot of that, which are not, at the forefront, but like what Palestine does as even just, as a place to be in solidarity with, in this kind of, Western project, is just, yeah, I just wanted to bring, that's it, my riff-raff.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Shailene, last word, and then I'm going to wrap up and open up for questions. Bring us to please.
I wrote some shit here I want to share with y'all. Okay. I'm going to make sure it comes across. Liberal multicultural navel gazing inside the empire was a backlash to third world liberation and solidarity. Anti-imperialism is the political line in the sand, breaks through all of the cosmetic language that passes itself off as a radical politic. To criticize capitalism, which is to say racial capitalism, neoliberalism, and colonization without an anti-imperialist lens is toothless. Remember that the Black Panther Party had an embassy in Algiers. If we are not thinking past the gated citadel we live in and studying how our oppressions are interglobally, to Ben's point, if we don't go back to that political line, which was snuffed out by COINTELPRO and silenced during the neoliberal turn to the right, if we are not thinking about solidarity in this way, then we risk reproducing imperialism, a multicultural imperialism, and I'm not down for that shit. So,
Thank you. So I just want to kind of say that, like, one of the contributions of DTP is that if you hear this conversation, we're coming from different places, and those don't get ironed out. They get reinforced as actually an approach to a system that is as complex, and we embody it by creating both a framework that doesn't simplify, right? And that holds space for that collective, takes the collective liberation project seriously. Now, the way we've done that is through targets, through action, because institutions are a reflection of what we're talking about. And then it allows you to strike with precision, right? And simultaneously, it gives you the good feeling versus something like being, wanting to go out a protest in the street, and then you're just in a cage, right? And they call it the free speech cage. These are the issues that I think Fred Moten would, just kind of refer to as like the imagination. Part of what we're dealing with here is the imagination and the inspiring and the learning and not being afraid of failure and finding each other and putting signals out in the world. But it's also to act transgressively, right? It's important that we choose to act with transgression, that we don't respect their legitimacy, right? That we don't respect the people that kill us, and that we don't actually resist in the ways that they just want us to. Now, to Andrew's point, I think the issue around scale isn't the issue that is an impediment to our organizing. I think the issue is structurally, how do we address the debts that we owe each other in the work that we do now, not later? An analysis that is reflecting of these different things doesn't support us sufficiently. Now, when you look at the Whitney, What was clear is that we were rattling cages, not just for the institution, right? But we were also limited, but it was amongst us. You know, at the end of the day, the biggest issue we're facing right now is that some people are invested in this system, right? And we as DTP choose to understand struggle and entry points to struggle on a spectrum, right? So these people with different viewpoints, whatever their motivations, we don't know what their positionalities are, that's fine, right? But we need to move, and we need to keep moving. And I think that in the context of our targets, it's not just that it's an alchemy, it's that we're trying to figure out and we're trying to find each other. So I think that for us, after this manual, it's going to be critical what kind of action comes out or initiative comes out of this. This is the first time that we're doing something, you know, in this, you know, across the colonial border. And we're trying to understand how we can be in
while being on
solidarity.
colonial Zoom.
While we can be on colonial Zoom, trying to do something. So I think we want to open it to questions. I just want to remind people that we're taking notes and then we're going to summarize towards the end. But, you know, finding targets, finding specificity is how we can advance the project, because we need to have leverage and we need to find our power. At the end of the day, it's how do we build our relationships? There's the win with an analysis, right? That as a byproduct, we level a blow against capital, imperialism, colonialism, whatever. So we're opening up for questions, Sally, and Sally's managing the questions process.
Yes.
Oh, and then anyone who wants to take a stab at the question, raise your hand or whatever, just make an indication.
Yep, and we'll figure that out. So we had a couple. First of all, thank you everyone for your comments, for your insight. You've given us so much to think about. But we had a couple of questions, we had a couple of questions from earlier on. I think this one is I'm going to start with this one. This was related to Ben's statement, and it was from Frank Schofield. How and where do you even build this research and knowledge of funding sources, power brokers, stakeholders, et cetera, to then inform our actions? I think that's a really useful question, particularly when we're talking about action, right? How do we attain this knowledge to which we can then inform the actions that we take? So I don't know if Ben is on and wants to take a stab at this, or anyone else.
Yeah, I could just
Ben's
answer quickly, and then everybody who else wants to jump on. But basically, always know who's paying for things, who's funding it. Once you find out who's funding it, then the question is, what is that person's political interest? If there's a museum, and then I'm actually the board member who's actually has the money funding it, then you got to say, okay, what is Ben's political interest? And what you'll find is that museum is just 1% of my financial support. The other 90% is in the real things I really care about, right? And from there you go, okay, bet. So that's the political. Once you determine my political interest is the money bag behind the venture, then you say, okay, then that means the museum's real intent is whatever my actual political interest. So if what I was doing was bombing kids in Yemen, or if I was whatever I was doing, if I'm from the tech industry, then that's that's what the actual function of the museum is behind the scenes. That's just a simple way to look at things, but you can just extrapolate that. Use your Googles and just, I think, commit to always having somebody on your team who's a researcher, and rotate that role amongst people, and then just get a practice of doing that.
I would like to also add is trust your gut. If something seems fishy, go down a rabbit hole and ask questions and stay curious, and take risk.
Thanks. I'm just going to interject something here really quickly. Mars has shared that www.littlesis .org is a great resource to tracing the money. And that's little sis, not lil. Okay, anyway.
Oh, did someone have their hand raised? Or I was just going to follow up on the topic of where do we go, or how do you go about finding the knowledge about how to do otherwise, right? I don't think it's a matter. Sometimes we think of it as there must be a document someplace. There must be something somewhere that we can pick up and it'll explain everything. Often it's a matter of, it's a practice, like my friend down here was saying, it's a practice, and it's a practice of what we would call visiting here, right? You have to be around, you have to be listening, you have to be engaging in the process of staying alive and being part of that process of helping out someone, of being around. And then through your listening and through your action together, that's how you're going to arrive at the understanding, because then that knowledge comes with the idea of what the stakes are. Okay, it's only going to be knowledge. It's only going to be up here until you are invested in the survival of these people who have been put out, who have been pushed out of the way by the state. It's only by being part of the struggle in an ongoing way that you're going to understand it, right?
Thank you. Does anyone else, would anyone else like to respond? And if not, I'll move on to another question. Okay. So this was, I think, the first question that we had, and Edie, I believe, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, would like to address the steps that Black people are taking to decolonize.
I don't know if Britt and Mars and Ben can take a stab at that.
I'm happy to take a stab at this. I can say this is hard work. One, engaging, and I can speak personally, right? Engaging in a process of healing daily as a practice, it's hard. Like seeing, like I think you have to put on many different lenses to see, right? And so I've used these things that I do in dance all the time to widen how I view things, because most of the time, my first response is actually triggering or trauma and shit that I have to deal with, right? So just pulling back these layers within my own self to figure out, hey, is this me responding? Is this an auntie in the past responding? Is it, like really evaluating my actions, how I'm showing up in space, how I'm having care for myself, and constantly interacting in an anti-Black ass world, right? And so that anti-Blackness is the shit that gets you over and over and over again, right? And also showing up and doing work. Right now, I'm supporting people coming out of jails and prisons. That means I interact with violence every other day. And not saying that they're violent, but the interaction in which the system deemed them as unredeemable, or dealing with someone that has been caged, that is temporarily like ableist, or like you know what I mean, like these levels of violence that they experience every day, and I am experiencing and working with them through a healing process, means or basic support. This brings up a lot of retriggering. So for me, I have to check myself constantly to be like, okay, is this the colonized Brittany that's speaking? Or is it like, I want to say fuck 5 times, I'm going to say fuck, 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 and be okay with it, right? And taking, allowing my body, because I mean, as a dancer, I've experienced liberation in my body moving. I have that opportunity to do that. right? So how do I take that feeling and work towards something because I know how it somewhat feels from a temporal performance. That makes sense? So like trying to decolonize how I see and think and all that type of stuff. And I'm done.
Yeah, I can jump in a bit here. I would just quickly, because a lot has already been said to this point, but I think a huge part of being Black and trying to decolonize yourself or your relationships or the kind of where you are is not, is thinking outside of whatever land you're currently on. So for the US, what we have to do is stop being so fucking US centric in Black liberation spaces. Please, for the love of God, it'll continue to recreate the shit that we're trying to fight. And the reason being is because, yeah, trust and believe, I understand I'm a queer Black woman on this stolen land. I wholeheartedly get it. But as American citizens, we are complicit in so much shit that, like, against other Black folks whose freedom is contingent upon, who our freedoms are interlaced, they're interwoven. So it's like, for us to kind of operate with blinders on, what does it look like to be free in North America even, is just so, and Ben was kind of getting to this in terms of like, picking up your cell phone, and or Amin was getting to this in terms of I think it was Amin, or maybe it was Yates actually, around how we're connected to folks as well when we enter museum spaces. But there are so many different ways to be connected, and I'm not saying, and I'm definitely not saying to take your ass over there to go live or something. Who I just read that, that's a whole other thing. I'm not saying to go like colonize these other lands by trying to get back to your roots and like please, dear God, no. But what I'm saying is that there are things you can read about online. There are different ways that you can get involved that way. There are different relationships that you can build. But also most, perhaps even more importantly than realizing our complicity is that when we reach outside of the US or outside of Canada or outside of our immediate locale, we're also reconnecting to our ancestors, both living and dead. And we're also reconnecting to roots that could be, the Black radical tradition or the Black radical imagination. So that's what's really important. Imperialism has disconnected us from our source. And it's important that we make those connections and we be ready to hold ourselves accountable when those connections are made.
Maz,
I think that's,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to briefly interject here. I think that those are really great points. And one of the things that occurred when I was living outside of Canada was the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement here. And one of the things that really heartened me when I read about it was to read that they were working alongside Idle No More, which was a movement that was started by Indigenous groups and Indigenous individuals within what I'm referring to as Canada. Shilane made this point, and I'll turn it over to her. I'm sorry, perhaps she can go after Ben. I think these are things to really be mindful of. I guess, as Black residents of the Americas, the ways in which our liberation struggles or our oppression has historically been linked to the genocide and displacement of Indigenous groups.
Shirley, you want to go ahead so you can follow up to that?
Say that real quick. Sorry, I wrote it in the chat, but I only sent it to the panelists, so I'll just say it right here. That the first decolonial understanding for Black descendants of chattel slavery is to understand that the dialogue was always supposed to be with the Indigenous people of Turtle Island about living on this land, not a negotiation with settlers over 40 acres and a mule. So when you readjust that shit, then, everything else collapses, I think.
And I also just want to make this point. As Black people, we are sovereign to this land. We're not residents, we're sovereign to this land, as we have because of forced labor, and because that we tended to these lands when I'm also Indigenous, I'm Cherokee and Seminole, right? And so right now there's a fight for Black people who are Cherokee and Seminole to claim who they are, right? And that's that anti-Black shit. And so we are sovereign to this land because we have a connection to this land. We nurtured this land. This is our home too. And also too, like we also have to, within the indigenous movement, recognize how anti-Blackness shows up, and for us to be residents, no, we're sovereign. Our ancestors shared this land, and we look at the laws of the land. This is our home too. I just want to say that. Sorry.
I want to jump on after that. Thank you for that, Brittany and Shalina. I'm actually going to
do not equate yourselves with me.
Someone else saying something? Oh, I think it's feedback. But I kind of want to follow up on what Mars was saying. Kind of like the way I look at decolonization as Black people is like I think Pan-Africanism and being Pan-African is a great way for us to reflect and really understand decolonization and not make things US-centric. Because Black people, the idea of Black people, the concept of Black America and African American is very recent. That thing is only 20, 30 years old, right? And what the looking at that terminology, you got to realize Black people didn't always identify with the United States. And so we got to really, Black people really, you got to study your people with the same respect you study anything else. It is not long ago that Black people would send US soldiers, would Black movements here would send Black people as soldiers in opposition to the United States, right? In opposition, in multiple theaters of war. We were like, nah, we don't identify with what the US is doing. We oppose it. So our liberation movement is going to join the opposition, right? And that's a thing that people have forgotten. I mean, the first slave revolts, those were transnational efforts. Like people just think that Black people were like, oh, we upset with slavery, so I'm gonna rise up. I mean, that was the reality too. But where was Denmark Vesey trying to go, right? He was in a deep dialogue with the Caribbean. And he was trying to, and it's not a coincidence that certain places were successful because people were timing their revolutions on a transnational clock. So you can think of, there's a reason why Haitians chose to rise up at a certain time when they got in the woods and they started to pray together. I forgot the name of the woman who kind of was one of the critical forces to gather them together. They chose that specific time because they understood what was going on in France. They understood how long it took for the ships to come to reinforce the island. They understood how many soldiers were on the island. They understood what was going on in the US. They understood what was going on in the other Caribbean islands. And then they chose a specific moment. And the minute they won anything, they immediately began to internationalize their fight so that they became the authors of liberation fights everywhere and around the world, right? So this idea of being decolonial, Black people have been doing this from jump. It ain't like there's nothing, you know what I'm saying? This ain't you. So what I encourage Black people to do is actually study your people. Look at your people the way you look at any other thing. If you're an artist, the way you study your art, look at your people and say, all right, what did they do? All right. And what were they thinking? What you find is nothing is new. There's none of these little debates that we have in or challenges or barriers. What is decolonialism? In fact, a lot of that, our thinking and our understanding is a lot behind where people were at even 40, 50 years ago, where the US government had to answer to Malcolm X when it was invading Africa, when it was going into the Caribbean. They had to answer to Paul Robeson, Nina Simone, when they were trying to get Nina Simone to be the face of America, and she was like, nah, right? So this is the Black people need to, you know, it's not like you don't gotta make new shit. It's your ancestors been done it. Study them in a rigorous way. Understand the Pan-African struggle started from jump. Before the ship started, we popped off. We were ready to go. Boom. You know what I'm saying? When they grabbed us in Africa, they had to kill 3 of us to take 1. You know what I'm saying? So this ain't nothing new.
one thing I want to kind of just add into this from, just like more as a Palestinian, not as a Black person, but as also a person who's worked in DTP, understanding that as a person who's, a guest to this land that I'm on, or a settler, not sure, is the colonial condition complicates things, right? And that's intentionally that way. So the resolution of the colonial condition doesn't happen instantly in a political program. This is why we emphasize relationships, and we emphasize action, and we emphasize study, and we emphasize coming together to figure it out. Because the ways in which we have to figure this out is relational, and it's with each other, and it's outside of these concepts that are positions now, and they dictate outcomes. So in DTP, the way we've gone about it is like, well, we recognize that we are on land that is both unceded, stolen. It has also been cared for by a lot of other indigenous groups that were forcibly displaced. It's something that, and the stewards of this land are in many other places, and there's all this stuff happening, and it's not different than what we see in Palestine. This is what it does, right? So, but it's also not reacting to that. It's like, how do we move towards collective liberation? How do we enact abolition and absence and making present now? How do we be in decolonial solidarity with the indigenous groups here, as a matter and a recognition that it takes all of us to get free, and we're both complicit in it, not as a position of like, say, I'm guilty, I'm wringing my hands, I'm doing all these things, but it's like, it's killing us too, and we need to not react to it, but we need to build with each other, and it needs to be genuine, and it needs to be in these sites that are actually sites of conflict, contention, misunderstanding, and material consequences as a result, right? So when we say Black liberation and we say indigenous sovereignty, we're recognizing two essential pillars from where we are that has built this empire, right? And that's to say we can't do anything, right? Not fight against prisons, not do any, unless we address those two things, right? And that becomes, what the outcome of that is, that's not for us to decide, because our solidarity is unconditional. Like my solidarity is unconditional. And it's never going to erase or simplify or try to distill what that conversation is, which is why what Shailene said is so dope. It's something that we're not used to doing, but even in our actions, if you look at the AMNH, the reason why the AMNH was so important is because they created the classifications in which different people can see themselves reflected and how they were screwed over in the present. What that did is different entry points for our struggles. So the framework of a structural approach with a manifestation physically of what that is, we were able to have a conversation that actually produced the brochures for the tours, which then brought not a decolonial knowledge that was created by many groups. And the groups that had a claim on or had an understanding or could lead from, they were the people that actually produced that language. And that was a conversation, but it got facilitated through action, and it was against an institution. So there was a refusal built in, and then there was a coming together, and it was both joyous and powerful. Then when you go to the, let's say from there to the Whitney, what was critical there is that it was contemporary art, right? It was contemporary art because the thing isn't in the past. But at the same time, how can you not essentialize struggles for some utilitarian nonsense that reproduces the same structures of oppression with different people on top, is by creating 9 weeks of action. If you look at 9 weeks of action, each week centered a struggle, right? And why didn't we say decolonization from the beginning? Because the organizing got started inside by the workers. I mean, that's what it was. And it's like, when the conversation is horizontal, you at least understand where people are at. When you agree to the terms that are laid from above, then you're just a tool in the process. And so we were trying to resolve this issue of like, well, it's obviously decolonization, we have an analysis, but we cannot abandon workers, front end and back end, who spoke on this. So how can we be in solidarity with them, right? So I'm bringing this up because it also can just be in our head, whatever we're talking about, right? In terms of what do we do? You have to also be out in the street, and you have to know Indigenous folks because they are there, they're rendered invisible, right? So that idea of I see you becomes part of that process of conversation, understanding where there's a set of privileges and things that can happen, things that I can do, not as a process of feeling better about your life. Right? That's not what we're talking about. We're actually literally talking about how land can go back, how it can abolish property, how there can be no prisons. What kind of society do we create now? And this is even just with Sally working on this thing. It's like, here's a show. What do we do with it? We don't give a fuck about a show.
I have a question for Jason, the OG Jason. Yes. So as I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, feel free to reflect it back towards me. You mentioned earlier on that you've worked in a lot of institutions where DTP and comrades have taken, have protested at. And do you ever feel perhaps a conflict or something that there is something that needs to perhaps be resolved working within these institutions when confronted with, I guess, basically these problematic histories that they were forged in? Or is it just a matter of the way in which, because of all of these entangled historical conditions, that we're always moving about or moving through these positions of contradiction?
So there definitely is a conflict felt internally, but felt by myself, by every artist who works there, by every person of color who works there, by every visitor who's there, everyone who supports who's there. So it is by no means is it just an individual situation for myself. I am just I'm a drop in the ocean in terms of working there and having these kinds of things happen. There are a lot, as we've noted today, there are a lot of contradictions that as Americans, and I am from the United States, we have to deal with just to get through reality, I think. And it's part of one of those, one is able to be an ally and a supporter without laying claim. You know, needing to have that kind of ownership. And there are one's activities. I think it's important that as an individual, we're able to mentally, to speak in metaphor, close tabs and focus on the things that are really, really important to us as our means of making a contribution to the greater good, or through that progress through cooperation and non-competition.
Well, I think we're good, right? How can we just see each other and say goodbye to everyone? Sally, do you want to usher us out, and then we can see each other for a second? And
yes. So I just want to again extend my heartfelt thanks to all who participated, both the speakers as well as those who were listening to this discussion. I just want to thank the thoughtfulness that came through from all of the questions and in everyone's, I'm going to call them presentations, everyone's, their contributions. Our next conversation will take place on Saturday, March the 13th at noon. Same bat time, same bat channel. So please continue to follow the events page. on the Art Gallery of Guelph's website and on the Decolonize This Place website and their Instagram for further updates and information. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye-bye.